My name is Varekine. I hold the rank of third archivist within the Verath Compact's Bureau of Incident Classification and Remediation, a position I have occupied for 31 cycles, and which I expect to occupy for at least another 20 before the Compact is obliged to find someone else to perform the role. Third archivist is not a senior rank. It is a working rank, the rank of someone who reads the files other people generate and determines whether they have been filed correctly and fixes them if they have not. I have no staff. I have an office the size of a generous storage cabinet. I have access to the full archive. The full archive is, it turns out, sufficient. I am not writing this account because anyone asked me to. I am writing it because the official record, as it currently stands in the Bureau's central archive, is wrong. Not wrong in the way records are sometimes wrong, missing a date here, a vessel registration transposed there, a cargo tonnage entered in the wrong column by an intake processor who was, one assumes, attending to several things at once. Those corrections are routine. I make dozens of them each cycle. They do not require documentation of this length. No, the record of the Kael-Dhur incident is wrong in the more fundamental sense. It describes what the Bureau believed happened aboard the prisoner transfer vessel Kael-Dhur on the 4th day of the Compact's 19th operational cycle, and what the Bureau believed is not, in any meaningful particular, what actually happened. The Bureau believed what it believed because the incident was classified in a way that made continued inquiry unnecessary. And it was classified in that way because the classification system had no appropriate category for what the evidence actually showed. And it had no appropriate category because no one had ever thought to create one, because no one had ever thought one would be needed. The category that was needed is, in plain language, what happens when an intake processor at Orath Station enters standard in the Origin World classification field for a Terran surface division, Specialist-Attaché from a Class 24 Deathworld. I have been attempting to correct the record for 17 cycles. The process has been slow, partly because of institutional resistance, and partly because 3 of the 4 witnesses who could corroborate the corrected account are no longer available to corroborate anything. The 4th witness, contractor 2nd grade Varekine, formerly of Shethverk Tactical Solutions, is available, but has declined to provide a formal deposition on 14 separate occasions. He has not declined on the 15th because I have not yet submitted a 15th request. I am considering my approach. In the interim, I am writing this. I will be precise. I will use the language of the Bureau, which is the language I know, and I will state clearly where the official record is accurate and where it is not. The reader who wants drama can find it elsewhere. The reader who wants to understand what happened aboard the Kael-Dhur on that day, and why it has taken the Bureau for Incident Classification and Remediation 17 cycles to acknowledge that its intake forms require revision, will find that here. I ask only that you read to the end before forming a conclusion. The end is the part that matters. The Kael-Dhur was a compact-registered prisoner transfer vessel, mid-tonnage class, commissioned 14 cycles before the incident, and operated under a rolling compact transit authority renewal by Varekine Passage and Freight, a private logistics company with offices at Orath Station and 5 other transit nodes throughout the outer corridors. It was not a prestigious vessel. It was a functional one. 11 crew, 4 contracted security staff, quarters for up to 62 prisoners in the standard sealed transfer configuration, a mess hall that the crew used and the prisoners did not, a medical bay rated for routine treatment, and a secondary compartment block in the midsection that served as rest and staging space for security personnel. The Kael-Dhur had made this particular route Orath Station to the resettlement compound at Kael-Dhur 41 times. It was, by any measure, a routine operation. The vessel's captain, a Varekine employee named Deathworld, had been making the same route for 11 cycles. He knew the corridors well. He knew the timing. He knew the kinds of passengers, if one could call them that, who occupied the transfer hold, and he had developed over 11 cycles the particular disposition of a man who has made the same unpleasant journey many times, and has decided that the correct relationship to it is professional distance. On this particular transit, the Kael-Dhur carried 47 human prisoners, all classified as Category C offenders under Compact Penal Code. Category C covers a wide range of violations: trade infractions, immigration statute violations, falsification of commercial documents, unlicensed operation of transit facilities, that share the characteristic of being offenses against compact regulatory frameworks rather than offenses against persons. The Compact does not, as a rule, transport violent human offenders on mid-tonnage vessels with security crews of 4. The risk calculus does not support it. Category C offenders are, in the Compact's classification system, a manageable population, people who made poor commercial decisions, or who navigated the outer corridors in ways the Compact's regulatory framework did not sanction, and who were now in transit to a resettlement facility where they would serve a fixed term and be released with a compliance record attached to their transit credentials. 47 Category C offenders, 4 security staff, 11 crew, a route made 41 times. The passenger manifest also listed one additional individual, designated as escort personnel. Her name was Dara Sen. Her rank was Specialist-Attaché, Terran Surface Division, a military classification that the Bureau's processing staff did not flag because they encountered Terran military designations with a frequency of approximately twice per operational cycle on mixed manifest transfers, and the designations were always, without exception in the Bureau's recent record, low-priority ancillary classifications: liaison personnel, transit observers, documentation officers. The occasional communications specialist. The Terran Surface Division seconded staff to compact operations on a regular basis under a mutual cooperation framework that the Compact and the Terran government had maintained for 9 cycles. The secondment staff were administrative and observational in function. They were not security threats. The intake field for Origin World classification had been filled in at Orath Station. The person who filled it in, I have identified them through the station's processing records, and I have not named them in this document because they are not the story's subject, and because their error, while consequential, was a procedural one rather than a negligent one. The person who filled it in had access to Dara Sen's Compact Transit Authorization, which was issued under the standard Terran Compact umbrella. They had her operational designation, Escort Personnel, Non-Combat. They had her rank, Specialist-Attaché, Terran Surface Division. What they did not have, because it was not included in the Compact Transit Authorization document, and because no one had built a verification step into the intake workflow that would have prompted them to check, was Dara Sen's military personnel file, which was maintained in the Terran Surface Division's internal registry, and which listed her homeworld as Vael-Mur, Class 24, Deathworld designation, assigned under the Compact's own classification index. They entered the field, Standard Terran Compact. The field was wrong. The field had always, in my experience of reviewing transfer manifests, been treated as a low-stakes entry for ancillary Terran personnel because it had never mattered before. It had never mattered before because the processing staff's assumption that Terran military secondment personnel were from standard classification worlds was correct in every prior case I can locate in the archive. The outer corridors do not produce a large volume of military secondment requests from Class 24 Deathworld natives. The assumption was a reasonable one. It was not correct this time. I want to describe Vael-Mur before I continue, because I think the description is necessary, and because the Bureau's file on the Kael-Dhur incident contains no description of Vael-Mur whatsoever. This absence is one of the record's central failures. Vael-Mur is classified Class 24 under the Compact's Hazardous World Index. The index was established 60 cycles ago as a standardized framework for characterizing the threat profile of inhabited and uninhabited worlds throughout the Compact's operational range, and it runs from Class 1, which represents baseline habitable worlds with no significant environmental threats to standard physiology species, up through Class 30, which represents worlds where no known standard physiology species can survive without full environmental isolation at all times. Class 24 is not the upper end of the scale. It is, however, well into the range where the index's practical language begins to shift from describing conditions to warning against them. The Compact's classification index entry for Vael-Mur, which I access through the Bureau's Scientific Liaison Archive, describes the following. Gravitational coefficient, 1.87 times the galactic median. This means that a standard physiology individual standing on Vael-Mur's surface is bearing nearly double the weight they would bear on a median world in every moment, with every movement, without cessation. The cardiovascular and musculoskeletal adaptations required to function in that environment over a lifetime are, according to the index's biomedical annex, substantial and cumulative. The index notes that standard physiology species attempting extended surface exposure without adaptive preparation have a median functional impairment onset of approximately 9 standard days and a median evacuation necessity within 22. Atmospheric pressure in Vael-Mur's middle biosphere, the inhabited zone, is classified as high stress for standard physiology, sufficient to cause barotrauma in unacclimatized individuals within 40 standard hours of unprotected exposure. The ambient atmospheric chemistry requires filtering for standard physiology respiratory systems. The temperate zones have particulate toxicity profiles classified as chronic exposure hazardous. The fauna. I spent some time with the fauna section of the index entry. The predator fauna of Vael-Mur's temperate zone average, according to the survey data the index compiles, approximately 2.3 times the mass of a standard adult human. Some of the larger categories reach considerably beyond that average. The index notes, in the dry language of classification, that the predator pressure on Vael-Mur's surface biome has historically been extreme, and that the human population's survival over 4,000 cycles in this environment reflects, in the index's phrasing, significant adaptive divergence from the galactic median human baseline across multiple physiological and behavioral axes. Significant adaptive divergence. I have been a Bureau archivist for 31 cycles, and I know bureaucratic understatement when I read it. What the index is saying, in the language it is permitted to use, is that the human population of Vael-Mur has spent 4,000 cycles being shaped by an environment that would kill most species that tried to live in it, and that this shaping has produced results. Dara Sen had lived on Vael-Mur for 27 years. She had then joined the Terran Surface Division, whose training program I will not attempt to characterize in detail, because the details I have been able to access are, frankly, of the kind that one sets down, and then sits with for a period of time before continuing. I will say that the division recruits heavily from high-classification Deathworlds, and that its training program is, by its own published doctrine, designed to build on the capabilities those recruits bring with them, not to create those capabilities from baseline. What the doctrine means, translated into plain terms, a person who grew up on Vael-Mur has already spent 27 years under gravity, nearly double the galactic median, breathing filtered air, developing the cardiovascular and musculoskeletal profile that surviving that environment requires. They have already navigated the predator pressure. They have already internalized, at a level that is no longer conscious deliberation, but simply the texture of daily existence, what it means to be slower than some of the things that want to kill you and to have survived anyway. The Terran Surface Division takes that person and spends 9 years teaching them to apply what they already are with discipline and economy. I have read the publicly available portions of the division's operational philosophy more than once. The part I return to is the section on what the division calls threat calibration, the trained capacity to assess a situation accurately, assign it the response it requires, and apply that response without excess. The document describes it in the dry language of military doctrine, but what it is describing is something I recognize from 31 cycles of bureau work. The ability to see a thing for what it is, not for what would be convenient or alarming, and to respond accordingly. To not mistake the shape of a situation for its substance. Dara Sen had been trained to do this for 9 years. She had been prepared for it by 27 years before that. The intake processor at Orath Station entered, Standard Terran Compact. I have looked at that field many times. I understand why they entered what they entered. I simply wish, with the particular wish of someone who has spent 17 cycles with this file, that they had checked one more registry before submitting the form. The registry existed. The data was in it. The form did not require anyone to check it, and so no one did, and so a single line in a combined field carried forward an assumption that was correct in every prior case and catastrophically inadequate in this one. The Kael-Dhur had been in transit for approximately 9 cycles when the Compact's enforcement authorization was issued. The authorization was not related to anything Dara Sen had done or anything she represented. I want to be precise about this, because I have encountered, in 17 cycles of working this file through the Bureau's internal channels, a tendency to retroactively associate the enforcement action with her presence aboard the vessel, as if the two things were connected. They were not. The enforcement action was initiated by the Compact's Trade Oversight Division, for reasons entirely separate from her assignment or her origin world. The relevant background is as follows. The Compact's Trade Oversight Division had, over approximately 6 operational cycles, been accumulating evidence that Varekine Passage and Freight, the Kael-Dhur's operator, had been systematically understating cargo valuations on prisoner transfer contracts. The mechanism was not complex. The contracts with the Compact's Resettlement Administration were priced according to cargo declarations, and Varekine had been declaring prisoner populations at lower per-head valuations than the actual contract specifications required, retaining the difference. Over 6 years, across 41 routes and a total of 3 registered vessels, this amounted to a sum that the Oversight Division's accounting analysis placed in the upper range of what the Compact's commercial code classified as significant fraud. The Oversight Division had also identified, through its investigation, a number of individuals within the prisoner population on active transfers who had provided information relevant to the fraud inquiry. These individuals were persons of interest. The Oversight Division wanted them transferred to Compact custody before they reached the resettlement compound at Kael-Dhur, where their availability for further inquiry would be administratively complicated. The authorization directed a boarding team to intercept the Kael-Dhur, secure the vessel, identify and detain the persons of interest from among the prisoner population, and transfer them to Compact custody under the relevant commercial investigation statute. The authorization was issued to Varekine Tactical Solutions. Varekine was, at the time of the Kael-Dhur engagement, one of 3 private enforcement contractors operating under Compact authority in the outer corridors. They held 17 active Compact contracts. They had completed 231 boarding operations over 19 cycles. Their record was, by the metrics the Compact used to assess contractor performance, operation completion rate, compliance without escalation, incident rate per engagement, strong. They were not the cheapest contractor. They were the most reliable. The boarding team assigned to the Kael-Dhur engagement consisted of 14 contractors led by Enforcement Commander Tarveth Osek. I should describe Tarveth Osek because he has been, in the official record, somewhat undercharacterized. The original incident report describes him as enforcement personnel, standard classification, which is accurate in the narrowest sense and completely inadequate in every other. Osek had 62 boarding operations to his credit across 12 cycles of field service. He had worked engagements ranging from routine commercial compliance checks to contested boardings of vessels whose operators had chosen active resistance. He had, according to Shethverk's internal performance files, which I accessed through the Compact's contractor oversight registry, never lost a boarding he had commanded. He was considered by Shethverk's operations directorate to be one of their 3 most effective field commanders. His assessments were thorough. His pre-operation planning was careful. He was Varekine. All 14 contractors were Varekine. I have noted already that the Varekine are not a species I would characterize as casual about their work. I want to expand on that characterization briefly, because I think it is necessary to understand what the incident means that it was these 14 individuals, specifically, who boarded the Kael-Dhur. The Varekine are large. A mature adult stands approximately 2/3 again the height of the galactic median, with a physique that reflects a home world at the upper end of standard habitable designations. They are not heavy gravity adapted in the way that Vael-Mur's population is, but they are, by any reasonable assessment, physically formidable by galactic median standards. More importantly, they are trained. Shethverk's contractor training program is not publicly available in detail, but the Compact's contractor oversight registry contains performance assessments that give a clear picture of what Shethverk contractors are capable of in field conditions. The bioluminescent iris pattern that gives Varekine their characteristic yellow glow appearance is, as I noted earlier, a marker of adrenal activation. It brightens under combat conditions. Experienced Varekine can read one another's readiness states in real time. They train in coordinated units. They are designed, in the sense that species shaped by long operational culture are designed, for the thing they do. Tarveth Osek reviewed the Kael-Dhur manifest before the boarding. I have his pre-operation threat assessment in the file. It runs to 11 pages. It is thorough. It covers the prisoner population individually, noting the Category C classification and the specific offense categories for each of the 47 prisoners. It covers the security crew's registered armament and training certifications. It covers the vessel crew's backgrounds, flagging 2 individuals who had previous compact regulatory interactions of minor significance. It covers the physical layout of the Kael-Dhur in detail, including the location of the secondary compartment block, the escort bay, the security access points, and the communication systems. On the final page, the assessment addresses the escort personnel. The entry is brief. It reads, 1-1 non-combat escort personnel, Terran, standard class origin. Operational designation, escort non-combat, no declared armaments, no applicable threat profile, no action required per standard boarding protocols unless resistance offered. The threat assessment table that generated this entry was functioning correctly as a tool. It generated the correct output for the inputs it received. The inputs were wrong. I have reviewed Osek's threat assessment. I have reviewed the intake form. I have reviewed the threat assessment table's source data. Osek did everything he was supposed to do. The failure was upstream of him, in an intake field that no one had ever needed to question. The boarding commenced at the 18th hour of the Kael-Dhur's 9th transit cycle. The intercept point had been calculated by Shethverk's logistics unit and coordinated with the Compact's transit authority. The Kael-Dhur's captain, Dasyarel, was given advance notice through the Compact's standard boarding authorization channel. Not enough notice to divert the vessel significantly, but sufficient to allow him to inform his crew and his security staff that a boarding was incoming, and that cooperation was the appropriate response. Rel's response to the notification, captured in the vessel's communication log, was brief. He said, "Understood. We'll be ready." He then, according to his own later account, which I obtained through the Oversight Division's investigation records, where he appears as a cooperating witness, informed his security staff, informed his crew, made a note in the vessel's operational log, and went back to what he had been doing. He had no stake in Varekine fraudulent billing practices. He had been flying this route for 11 cycles. He had no intention of adding obstruction of a compact enforcement action to his professional record over a billing dispute he had nothing to do with. The boarding team entered the Kael-Dhur through the forward docking collar at the vessel's standard transit speed. The docking sequence took approximately 11 minutes from the initial collar contact to a secure seal. Varekine OSEC's personal field unit, a voice and environmental capture device that Varek's commanders carry as a standard operational record, was active throughout and captured the full sequence. I have listened to it several times. It sounds like a professional boarding operation, because it was one. Efficient, methodical, with clear communication between team elements and a commander who gave instructions in the measured cadence of someone who has done this many times and expects it to go the way it always goes. The boarding team split into 3 elements once the docking collar was secured, and the vessel's entry hatch was confirmed open. Elements 1 and 2, 11 contractors total, proceeded through the forward corridor toward the prisoner transfer hold in the Kael-Dhur's aft section. Their assignment was to locate and secure the vessel's prisoner population, identify the persons of interest designated in the Oversight Division's authorization, and establish controlled custody of the transfer hold for the duration of the operation. They were accompanied by a Compact Oversight Division representative, an administrative specialist named Kael-Dhur, who carried the identification and documentation required to formally take custody of the persons of interest once they had been secured. Element 3, Varekine OSEC and 4 contractors, including Varekine, proceeded toward the secondary compartments. Their assignment was the general sweep of the vessel's non-prisoner areas, crew quarters, operational sections, and the escort bay in the midsection where the security staff's rest area and the non-prisoner personnel accommodations were located. The prisoner hold elements completed their work without incident. I want to be accurate about this. The operation, from the perspective of the element that was doing the thing it had been authorized and sent to do, was successful. The 47 human prisoners were in the transfer hold, and they were cooperative when informed through the vessel's public address system that a compact enforcement boarding was in progress and that compliance with boarding team instructions was required. There were no altercations, no resistance. The persons of interest, 2 individuals, a former Varekine freight agent and a transit documentation specialist who had each provided information to the Oversight Division's inquiry, were identified from the manifest, confirmed by Kael-Dhur's documentation, and transferred to the Oversight Division's custody. The transfer hold elements completed their work in approximately 40 minutes and filed an after-action note that is, in my review, accurate, complete, and unremarkable. That portion of the boarding is not what this document is about. Element 3 reached the escort bay at approximately the 40-minute mark of the boarding operation. I am going to describe what the escort bay's monitoring systems recorded during the period that followed. I will describe it with the precision of a bureau archivist who has reviewed the relevant records a number of times, and I will try not to editorialize, though I will admit that 17 cycles with this material has made complete neutrality difficult. The escort bay is a small compartment, 4 bunk frames, a supply locker, a food preparation station, a table bolted to the deck, lighting panels in the ceiling that maintain a flat, functional illumination. The kind of space that is designed to serve a purpose and has been designed to serve only that purpose. The Kael-Dhur's midsection sensor suite includes a full monitoring package for all secondary compartments: motion tracking array, sound pressure monitor, thermal imaging, visual capture. All 4 systems were active and recording. The sensor logs show Varekine's presence in the escort bay continuously from the 22nd hour of the 9th transit cycle, approximately 18 standard hours before the boarding commenced. She had, by the time the boarding team docked, been at rest for most of that period. The motion array shows her in one of the bunk frames for a sustained interval consistent with sleep, and then active at various points. The galley log, which the Kael-Dhur maintained for supply accounting purposes, shows several standard ration draws attributed to her transit authorization during the preceding days, all within the normal consumption range for a Terran military individual on extended transit. The sensor logs show a change in her activity pattern at approximately the time the boarding team's docking collar contact would have been detectable through the vessel's structural sensors. The Kael-Dhur's internal sensor system does not record structural vibration directly, but the motion array in the escort bay shows her moving from the bunk to the food preparation station at a time that correlates, within the sensor log's time resolution, to the docking collar's initial contact. She had been awake, she had heard the docking, and then she had gone to make herself a meal. I want to be careful about how I describe my reaction to this, because I am an archivist and not a commentator, and because it would be easy, and probably wrong, to read dramatic significance into something that may be entirely practical. Perhaps a Terran Surface Division Specialist-Attaché, reviewing the available information, concluded that a compact enforcement boarding on a prisoner transfer vessel she was assigned to escort was not a situation requiring her immediate operational response, and that the sensible thing to do was eat something. Perhaps she was hungry. Perhaps both things were true simultaneously, and the question of significance is mine and not hers. The galley log records a standard Terran Surface Division field ration, protein and carbohydrate composite, self-heated, drawn and processed at the escort bay's food preparation station. The ration draw timestamp is approximately 4 minutes before Element 3's corridor sensors first detected the team's approach. By the time Varekine opened the escort bay door, she was seated at the table eating. The door sensor log records the moment of entry. The visual capture record shows what Varekine saw when he entered: a small human individual seated at the bolted table, facing the door, with a ration container and a utensil in front of her. She looked up when the door opened. Then she looked back at her food. Varekine soon, in the deposition I have referenced throughout this document, the deposition he declined to give formally but which the Kael-Dhur medical staff obtained under the applicable authority and which I located after 4 cycles of searching under its anomalous filing designation, soon describes this moment. He says, "She looked up at the commander when the door opened. Then she looked back at her food and kept eating. I don't know why I remember that specifically. I think I remember it because none of us expected it. We were 14 armed contractors, and we had just boarded a vessel, and she looked at us and looked back at her food. I didn't understand it at the time. I understand it better now, I think, though I'm not certain understanding is the right word for what I have." Varekine announced the boarding authority. The audio record captures his voice, measured, professional, the tone of someone who has opened 231 boarding operations, and expects the 232nd to proceed the same way. He instructed the individual to stand, identify herself, and submit to a compliance check per the Compact's boarding protocol standards. Varekine set her utensil down. The motion array records the small movement. She looked at Varekine. She said, "I have my transit credentials on the table. You can check them." The visual record shows the identification card on the left side of the table, placed there. The sensor timestamp indicates before the boarding team entered the corridor. It had been there when Varekine opened the door. It had been visible to him from the doorway. She did not stand. She picked up her utensil and resumed eating. The audio record captures a pause. Then Asek repeats the instruction to stand. She says, "My identification is on the table. My orders are filed with the vessel's captain. If you need to verify my authorization, Captain Rel can provide the documentation." She does not stand. Asek's field unit audio captures a brief interval of silence. I have listened to it carefully. It is a short silence, 2 seconds at most, and in it, I think I can hear something that I am not certain how to classify in Bureau language. It is the sound of a situation not conforming to its expected shape. Nothing dramatic, just a small mismatch between the script that 231 previous boardings have established and the situation that is, in fact, present. Asek addresses his contractors. He instructs 2 of them, Contractor Veth Kaz and Contractor Del Soth, to secure the subject and conduct the compliance check by manual procedure. This is Protocol 2 under Shethverk's boarding guidelines. When a subject does not comply with the verbal compliance request, 2 contractors physically secure the subject, and the check is conducted without the subject's cooperation. It is not a punitive escalation. It is a procedural one. In 231 operations, Protocol 2 had, per Shethverk's own after-action records, produced compliance, either immediate physical compliance or the subject's decision to cooperate once physical contact was initiated, in every case in which it had been applied to a non-Category A subject. Vael-Mur's description of what followed is the most precise account available, and I have reproduced it at length in my earlier notes, but I want to add here the detail that the motion array supplies, because the motion array is an objective record and soon is not. The motion array shows Veth Kaz approaching the table. It shows his hand making contact with Dara Sen's left shoulder. This is the last clear positional state that makes obvious intuitive sense. What follows is a sequence of positional changes at a rate that taxes the array's sampling capacity. The array was designed for security monitoring of a transfer vessel, not for capturing high-speed physical events, and what it captures are positions, not the movements between them. A series of frames, not a continuous record. Like photographs taken during a storm, each one clear, the sequence between them implied. The thermal imaging array is more informative in some ways, because it captures continuous data. What it shows during this interval is a brief, sharp elevation in Dara Sen's core temperature, consistent with moderate exertion, not high exertion, and then, within a much shorter period than I would have expected, a return toward baseline. The contractor's thermal signatures show elevated readings that persist considerably longer. The sound pressure monitor shows ambient noise throughout the interval, no raised voices, no distress indicators. The predominant sound in the escort bay, per the monitor's frequency analysis, is the hum of the Kael-Dhur's atmospheric processors and briefly, sounds consistent with physical contact and movement. Brief, and then ambient again. When the motion array resolves to stable positions, 4 contractors are on the floor of the escort bay. Vael-Mur is in the corridor outside the door, which is still open. Dara Sen is standing beside the table. The thermal record shows her temperature still descending toward baseline at this point. By the time she speaks, it is there. She says, "Are there more of you in the corridor?" The audio record captures Soon's reply. He says, after a pause that I have measured at approximately 3 seconds, the pause of someone recalibrating the variables of the situation they are in, "No." She says, "All right, I'm going to finish eating. Tell your commander when he's ready to talk that my identification is still on the table." The audio record captures a chair moving back. The motion array shows her seated position resumed. The thermal array shows resting baseline. She finished eating. I want to dwell on this for a moment, because I think it is the part of the incident that the original classification most thoroughly fails to capture. The standard compact framework for assessing incidents of this kind focuses on the outcome and the classification of the parties involved. By the framework's own logic, this incident was anomalous because a non-combat classified individual had rendered 4 armed contractors non-operational in a time interval the framework's outcome assessment tables had no row for. The framework had no row for this because no one had ever entered the wrong origin world classification for someone from Vael-Mur before, and so the situation had never arisen, and so no row had been created for it. And so when it did arise, it landed in the anomalous category, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of a tray marked to be sorted later. That 17 cycles later is still waiting to be sorted. The anomalous designation was not, I want to be fair, the result of bad faith. It was the result of a framework encountering something outside its design parameters. That is what anomalous means. The problem is that anomalous also means no action required pending review, and review was never completed, and so the incident remained filed in a way that preserved the fiction that it had been, at some level, understood. It had not been understood. I know this because I have spent 17 cycles understanding it, and it has not been easy. What I think the incident shows, what the corrected record needs to establish, so that the institutional lesson can be clearly stated, is this. Dara Sen was not behaving abnormally for what she was. This is the central point. She was behaving entirely normally for what she was. She had identified herself. She had provided her credentials. She had indicated where the verification documentation was and who held the supporting records. When those avenues were not taken and a physical compliance procedure was initiated, she addressed the compliance procedure in the manner that her training and her origin world had spent 36 years preparing her to address it. And then she returned to her meal. There is a phrase in the Terran Surface Division's publicly available mission doctrine that I found in the Diplomatic Liaison Archive, economy of action. I am not fluent in Terran military doctrine, but I believe I understand what the phrase means. You use what the situation requires. You use no more. You do not escalate beyond the level the situation actually presents. You do not perform. You assess and you respond and you return to baseline, because you are going to need that baseline again. Dara Sen's thermal record returned to resting baseline before she sat back down. That is the record of a person who assessed what they encountered, determined what it required, applied what was necessary, and moved on. A person who was not frightened by what she had just done, not elevated by it, not changed by it in any way the sensors could detect. She had been interrupted while eating. She finished eating. The table was still there. The food was still there. The interruption was over. This is, I think, what the origin world classification field is for, not for generating paperwork, for telling the people who need to know what they are about to encounter. Someone filled it in wrong. Tarveth Osek recovered consciousness approximately 40 minutes after the incident. I have his recovery sequence from the audio field unit, which was still recording throughout. The unit had been on the floor of the escort bay for the duration. The first sounds it captures from Osek are disoriented, elevated respiratory, a few vocalizations that the audio transcription renders as unclear. And then, gradually, the cadence of a person reassembling the situation they are in from the pieces available to them. When he has been conscious and stable for approximately 7 minutes, he enters the escort bay. Dara Sen is at the table. The ration container from her meal is visible at the edge of the visual frame, empty. She has her data tablet. She is reviewing something on it. She does not look up immediately when he enters. He stands in the doorway for a moment. The visual record shows him upright, functional, his posture that of someone who is making a deliberate effort to inhabit his command bearing. He largely succeeds. He says, "I need to know what you are." She looks up from the tablet. She looks at him for a moment. Then she says, My identification is on the table. It's been there the whole time. He crosses to the table. He picks up the identification card. He reviews it. The audio record captures the pause longer than the earlier ones. He is reading it carefully, perhaps reading it more than once. He says, "This says Terran Surface Division." She says, "Yes." He says, "Your origin world classification on the transfer manifest says standard." She says, "That's not accurate." A brief pause. "What does it say for the homeworld?" He reads it. He says, "Standard Terran Compact." She says, "Vael-Mur, Class 24, someone at Orath Station filed it wrong." The audio record captures a silence that I have measured at 11 seconds. In Bureau work, 11 seconds of silence in a recorded conversation is unusual. I have listened to it several times. I do not know what Tarveth Osek was thinking during those 11 seconds. I know that when he speaks again, his voice is different, not in any dramatic way, but in the way that a voice is different when the person using it has recalculated the situation they are in and arrived at different coordinates than the ones they started with. He says, "Class 24. She says, "Yes." He says, "The highest I've worked a boarding against is a Class 9 world's population. Once." She says, "How did it go?" He says after a pause, "We withdrew." She says, "That's reasonable." There is a longer silence. The audio record captures what I believe to be the sound of Osek sitting down across the table from her. He sits across the table from her. This is not, I think, a formally defensible enforcement posture. It is what a person does when they need to sit down. He says, "What do you want to happen now?" She says, "I want to finish my transit assignment and deliver the prisoner detail to Kael-Dhur according to my orders. I assume you want to complete your boarding and take custody of whoever you came for. Those things are compatible." He says after a moment, "You're not going to report this." This is not a question in the way he says it. It is a statement that carries the shape of a question, the shape of a person who is uncertain about the answer, but needs to ask it in a form that doesn't sound like he's asking a favor. She says, "Report what? I identified myself. You verified my credentials. Your crew conducted a compliance check. There was a procedural misunderstanding based on an inaccurate intake form. You have the paperwork you came for, and I have a transit assignment to complete." A silence. She says, "I'd suggest your contractor liaison submit a request to the Compact's Intake Processing Division to add a mandatory separate field for Origin World classification, independent of transit status. The current form bundles it with operational category, which creates ambiguity." Another silence, longer. He says, in a voice that has a quality I find difficult to classify in Bureau language, but which I might describe as very dry and very careful, "You're recommending a form revision." She says, "The form is wrong. Someone should fix it." Vael-Mur soon remained in the corridor for the duration of the exchange I have described above. His deposition notes that he heard most of it through the open door. He describes his own state during this period as attempting to account for the variables, which he says he did not succeed in doing to his satisfaction. He says in his deposition, "I kept trying to understand what I had seen. Not in the sense of not believing it, I had been there, I had seen it, I am not someone who denies what I've seen, but in the sense of where does that fit? What column does that go in? I had a framework. I had 22 cycles of experience, 12 of them in the field, and what I had seen didn't fit in any part of the framework that I knew. It wasn't, she wasn't. I don't know how to say this in a way that sounds like a formal deposition. She was eating. She stopped, and then some things happened that I don't have precise language for, and then she sat back down and finished eating. And that's what I keep returning to, not the middle part, the sitting back down. The fact that to her the appropriate thing to do when the interruption was over was to sit back down and finish what she'd been doing, because it was still food. It was still there. The situation was the same situation it had been before we opened the door, except that 4 people were on the floor. And that apparently was not a thing that changed the valuation of finishing a meal. I think this is, in its own way, a precise description of what the incident means. The situation, from her perspective, was the same situation it had been before the door opened. There was food. The food was unfinished. The people who had interrupted the finishing of the food had been addressed. She sat back down. That is what economy of action looks like when it is operated by someone who has spent 36 years developing it. The boarding was completed without further incident. Tarveth Osek rejoined his team, confirmed with Captain Rel that the operation was complete, and transferred the 2 designated persons of interest to the Oversight Division's representative. The Kael-Dhur was cleared to continue its transit to Kael-Dhur. Shethverk's vessels departed on their own scheduled return. The after-action report that Osek filed describes the operation as completed successfully with 1 personnel incident in the secondary compartment, classified anomalous. He does not elaborate extensively. The report notes that all contractors received medical evaluation and were cleared for return to base. It notes that the persons of interest were secured and transferred. It notes that the vessel and its captain cooperated fully throughout. It does not note that Dara Sen recommended the form revision. I note it here because I think it should be in the record. Dara Sen completed her transit assignment without further incident. The Kael-Dhur arrived at Kael-Dhur on schedule, 11 cycles after the boarding. She filed a transit completion report with the Terran Surface Division, 3 sentences, as I have noted. I obtained a copy through the Diplomatic Liaison Archive. It reads, in its entirety, transit completed as ordered. Compact enforcement boarding occurred during transit cycle 9. Credentials were verified. Operation completed without interference with escort assignment. Note, Origin World classification on compact intake form contained an inaccuracy. Recommend verification procedure for future mixed manifest transfers. 3 sentences. One of them, a recommendation that matches what she told Osek across the escort bay table. She recommended the form revision twice. Once to the enforcement commander who had just tried to conduct a compliance check on her, and once in a 3-sentence report to her own chain of command. It was not a thing she made drama out of. It was a thing the form was doing wrong, and she noted it through the appropriate channels. I found her completion report in the Liaison Archive during the 3rd cycle of my review process, and I read it, and then I sat with it for a while before continuing. Let me now describe what happened to the people who were in the escort bay on the 4th day of the Kael-Dhur's transit, because I think their trajectories are part of the record. Tarveth Osek was evaluated at Shethverk's regional medical facility within 2 cycles of returning from the Kael-Dhur engagement. He was cleared for operational duty. He returned to field command with Shethverk within 2 cycles of clearance. He submitted a formal request to Shethverk's Operations Directorate to be transferred to a regional contract portfolio that did not include mixed manifest transfers involving Terran military personnel. The request was granted without significant internal discussion, according to the Operations Directorate's records, which I accessed through the Contractor Oversight Registry. His current assignment, as of my most recent check, is a contract portfolio covering commercial compliance boarding in the inner corridor trade routes, which involves no Terran military personnel. His performance assessments continue to be strong. He has not, to my knowledge, spoken publicly about the Kael-Dhur incident. He declined to provide a formal deposition when I submitted the request through standard channels. I have not submitted a second request. Contractors Veth Kaz, Del Soth, and the 3rd contractor, whose name the audio record does not definitively establish. The visual capture can be cross-referenced with crew manifests, but I will not reproduce the full name here without a formal identification confirmation. Were all medically cleared within the same 2-cycle window. All three returned to Shethverk's field roster. Their subsequent assignments do not appear in the records I have access to, and I have not attempted to locate them beyond what the contractor oversight registry shows. Vael-Mur soon did not return to field operations. He applied for medical clearance following the incident, was cleared, and then declined all field assignment offers for 11 cycles, citing in his clearance renewal filings the reason I mentioned at the start of this document: unresolved operational questions. He is currently employed in a logistics coordination role at Shethverk's Asa compound. He has declined 14 formal deposition requests from me across 17 cycles. He has not declined a 15th because I have not submitted one. I have considered submitting it. I have decided against it. He gave me what I needed through the Kael-Dhur Medical Authority process. I do not think requiring him to revisit the Escort bay through formal testimony will produce additional information that the medical deposition did not already capture. I am a third archivist. I know the limits of what a record requires. I want to return one final time to the form. The intake processing field for Origin World classification, as it existed during the cycle of the Kael-Dhur incident, was a single-line entry combined with the operational category field. The combined field produced a single classification output. For example, Escort Personnel Non-Combat Standard Terran Compact. The threat assessment table that Shethverk and every other compact-authorized boarding contractor used when planning operations read the Origin World portion of that output, Standard Terran Compact, and assigned the appropriate threat classification from its table. For Standard, the classification was non-threat. There was a column and there was a checkbox, and the checkbox was marked. The form had not been revised in 9 cycles. It had not needed revision in 9 cycles, because in 9 cycles of mixed manifest transfers involving Terran military personnel, the Origin World classification had never been materially wrong in a way that affected a boarding operations threat assessment. This was not because the classification was always accurate. It was because, in every prior case, the classification error, if any existed, was immaterial. A liaison officer from a Class 6 world entered as Standard presents no operationally relevant difference to a boarding team. A communications specialist from a Class 7 world entered as Standard presents no operationally relevant difference. The slack in the system was never taken up because the system had never encountered a case where the slack mattered. Until the Kael-Dhur. The corrected form, which the Bureau's Intake Processing Division has now implemented for all mixed manifest transfers involving Terran military personnel, following this corrected record, and a series of communications between my office and the division head that I will charitably describe as persistent, requires Origin World classification to be verified against the Terran Surface Division's personnel registry before the combined field is completed. The field is now 2 lines, not 1. The Origin World classification and the operational category are entered separately. They generate independent outputs for the threat assessment table. A contractor planning a boarding now receives a threat assessment entry that reads, for a Specialist-Attaché from Vael-Mur. Escort Personnel Non-Combat Origin World, Vael-Mur, Class 24 Deathworld designation. The form is 2 pages longer. There is an additional verification step. The processing time for mixed manifest intake is approximately 4 minutes longer per form. I regard this as a reasonable cost. In my experience, 31 cycles of it, the length of a form is sometimes an accurate reflection of the complexity of what it is trying to capture. The previous form was not capturing the complexity of what it needed to capture. It was capturing a simplified version of it, and the simplification was fine until it wasn't. And when it wasn't, the consequences were significant in ways that will not appear in official statistics, because the medical outcomes were all cleared, and the operational outcome was completed successfully, and Vael-Mur's deposition was filed under anomalous and pending review. The consequences appeared in Osek's transfer request. They appeared in Soon's 11 cycles of declined assignments. They appeared in 3 sentences and a recommendation that someone fixed a form, filed by a woman who was not going to spend 17 cycles on this because she had a transit assignment to complete and other things to do. I think about the gap between those two things fairly regularly. An experienced enforcement commander with 62 boardings and a record of no losses, transferred by his own request away from an entire category of work. A field contractor with 22 cycles of experience, spending 11 cycles on unresolved operational questions before accepting a logistics desk. These are individuals whose professional self-understanding was organized around a specific kind of competence, and what they encountered in the escort bay of the Kael-Dhur was a situation in which that competence was, in a practical sense, beside the point, not defeated by something greater in kind, set aside by something different in kind. That is, I think, the harder thing to accommodate. If you are outmaneuvered by someone better at the thing you do, the category is familiar. You recalibrate within a framework you already understand. If you encounter something that does not fit the framework, something that looks from the manifest like the thing you are prepared for, and is not, the recalibration is more fundamental. Soon said in his deposition that he kept trying to count how many there were and kept arriving at the same answer, and kept trying to make that answer wrong. He has been trying for 17 cycles. I do not know that he has succeeded. Dara Sen wrote 3 sentences. I am going to close this record now. I have described the Kael-Dhur incident with the accuracy available to me after 17 cycles of reconstruction from incomplete sources. I have documented what happened and what should have been documented at the time and what the Bureau has done eventually to prevent the same procedural gap from producing the same outcome in the future. I have done this because it is my function. A third archivist reads what is in the files and determines whether it is correct. When it is not correct, he corrects it. This is not a prestigious function. It is a necessary one. The distinction between what a record says happened and what actually happened is, in my experience, always worth clarifying, even when the clarification requires 17 cycles and the cooperation of only one of 4 available witnesses. There is one final entry I want to make. In the cycle following the submission of my preliminary corrected record draft to the Intake Processing Division, I received a communication through the Bureau's Diplomatic Liaison Routing Address. It was not a formal document. It was a brief message, plain text, without military formatting, addressed to the Bureau's General Correspondence Inbox. The correspondence clerk who received it routed it to me because my name was on the corrected record submission as the filing archivist. The message said, "I heard you updated the form. Good, it was wrong." It was not signed. The origin address traced to a Terran Surface Division routing node that the liaison office characterized as a standard long-haul transit communications relay, the kind of node used by military personnel on extended assignment to route personal correspondence through the Compact's general channels. I cannot verify that the message was from Dara Sen. I have chosen not to investigate further, on the grounds that 17 cycles is enough time to spend on one incident, and on the grounds that the message is precisely consistent with everything the evidence suggests about how she approached the entire matter. The form was wrong. Someone fixed it. That is the relevant fact. The communication is complete. I have entered the message in the corrected record as received correspondence, unverified origin, filed under the Kael-Dhur incident reference. This corrected record is now complete. The official classification of the Kael-Dhur incident as corrected is as follows. Compact Enforcement Boarding, Kael-Dhur Transfer Vessel, Cycle 19, Day 4. Boarding operation completed successfully. Persons of interest secured and transferred. Personnel incident in secondary compartment arising from intake processing error. Origin world classification for escort personnel entered as standard in error. Actual classification Vael-Mur, Class 24 Deathworld designation. 4 contractor personnel non-operational for recovery interval, all medically cleared, no fatalities, no lasting injuries, no vessel damage, no charges filed, no disciplinary action warranted. Root cause, single field intake form insufficient to capture origin world data independent of operational category. Corrective action, form revised, verification step added, intake processing division notified. Case closed. I am Varekine, 3rd Archivist, Bureau of Incident Classification and Remediation, Verath Compact. I have stated my name at the beginning of this document, and I state it again at the end because the Bureau's corrected record format requires it, and because I spent 17 cycles on this file, and because the record should know who did the work of correcting it, and I think that is sufficient reason to sign it twice. The record is correct, the form is fixed, that is sufficient.